There's a man who lived over 2,000 years ago, and most of what we know about him might not even be true. His name was Lao Tzu, or at least that's what they called him. It's not even a real name. It just means old master. No birth records, no verified history. Some scholars aren't even sure he existed at all. But here's what we do know. He worked as an archivist in the royal court of the Zhou dynasty. A quiet man, a keeper of records. And for decades, he watched. He watched kingdoms rise and collapse under their own weight. He watched ambitious men claw their way to power, only to be destroyed by the very force that drove them there. He watched people exhaust themselves chasing things that never mattered. And at some point, he'd seen enough. The story goes that Lao Tzu, old and disillusioned, decided to leave civilization altogether. He climbed onto a water buffalo and rode toward the western border of China. Just left. No farewell tour, no grand declaration, no disciples begging him to stay. He simply turned his back on the world and walked away. But at the border, a guard recognized him, and this guard made one request, that the old master write down his wisdom before disappearing forever. So Lao Tzu sat down, and in what some say was a matter of days, he produced a slim, strange text, 81 verses, roughly 5,000 characters. That text became the Tao Te Ching, one of the most translated books in human history, second only to the Bible. And then he walked through the gate, and no one ever saw him again. Now, here's what makes this man's philosophy so unsettling to the modern mind. Lao Tzu argues something that cuts against everything we've been conditioned to believe. He says that effort, raw, grinding, relentless effort, is not the path to a meaningful life. He warns that the harder you push, the more life resists you. He points out that the people who struggle the most are often the ones fighting against themselves. Trying harder, he believed, is not the answer. It might actually be the problem. There's something deeply wrong with the way most people approach life. They push, they grind, they force themselves through every obstacle, believing that more effort is always the answer. And when things don't work out, they push even harder. But what if that's the exact thing destroying them? Over 2,000 years ago, a man named Lao Tzu looked at the world and saw the same pattern. People exhausting themselves, chasing things that didn't matter, forcing outcomes that were never meant to be forced. And he said something that most people, even today, are not ready to hear. Stop trying so hard. Not because effort is meaningless, but because the kind of effort most people pour into their lives, the desperate, white-knuckled, teeth-gritting kind, is working against them. Lao Tzu argues that the more you struggle against the natural flow of life, the more life resists you back. It's not laziness he's advocating. It's something far more radical than that. He calls it Wu Wei, and it doesn't mean doing nothing. It means not forcing. There is a difference, a massive one. Think about it. Water doesn't try to flow downhill, it just does. A tree doesn't strain to grow, it simply grows. Lao Tzu points out that nature accomplishes everything without effort, without ambition, without a 5-year plan. And yet it never fails to get things done. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable, because everything you've been taught says the opposite. Work harder, sleep less, hustle more, set bigger goals. And if you're not where you want to be, you're clearly not trying hard enough. Lao Tzu would say that's insanity. He warns that this obsession with striving, this relentless need to control, to grip, to force, is the very thing pulling people apart from the inside. The anxiety, the burnout, The feeling that no matter what you do, it's never enough. That's not a sign you need to try harder. That's a sign you've been trying wrong. And the worst part? Most people can't even see it. They're so deep in the cycle of pushing and grinding, they've confused exhaustion with progress. They think suffering means they're on the right path. Lao Tzu says no. Suffering means you've lost the path entirely. He makes a claim that cuts against everything modern culture stands for. He argues that the person who achieves the most is often the one who forces the least. That true mastery doesn't look like struggle. It looks like ease. Not the ease of someone who doesn't care. The ease of someone who is so aligned with what they're doing that resistance simply disappears. That sounds impossible, maybe even irresponsible. But Lao Tzu wasn't interested in what sounded reasonable. He was interested in what was true. And what he observed, in nature, in leadership, in the human spirit, was a pattern so consistent it couldn't be ignored. The things that try too hard break. The things that remain soft endure. So before you dismiss this as some ancient philosophy with no relevance to your life, consider one thing. You've already tried the other way. The grinding, the forcing, the relentless effort that was supposed to fix everything. And if you're honest with yourself, how's that working out? Lao Tzu suggests there's another way, not easier, but truer, and that is exactly what we're going to walk through here. His words, his warnings, his vision of a life that doesn't demand you destroy yourself just to feel like you matter. There's a concept at the very heart of Lao Tzu's teaching that most people hear and immediately misunderstand: Wu Wei. It's often translated as non-action or doing nothing, and that translation has done more damage than almost anything else in Western readings of the Tao Te Ching. Because when people hear do nothing, they think laziness, they think passivity, they think sitting on a couch and waiting for life to hand you something. That's not what Lao Tzu means, not even close. Wu Wei isn't about doing nothing. It's about not forcing. It's about acting without resistance, without friction, without that grinding, teeth-clenching effort that most people mistake for productivity. Lao Tzu argues that the highest form of action is the one that doesn't feel like action at all. Think about water for a moment. Water doesn't try to flow downhill. It just does. It doesn't fight the rock in its path. It moves around it. Or, given enough time, it moves through it. And Lao Tzu points to this again and again as the model for how a person should move through life, not with brute force, but with a kind of intelligent yielding. He says, "The Tao does nothing, yet nothing is left undone." And that line alone has confused people for centuries. But what he's really getting at is this: the most powerful forces in nature don't announce themselves. They don't strain. Gravity doesn't try. It pulls. The seasons don't struggle to change. They just turn. And Lao Tzu argues that human beings, at their best, operate the same way. But here's where it gets uncomfortable, because we've been taught the opposite. We've been told that more effort equals more results, that grinding harder is the answer, that if something isn't working, you just push more. And Lao Tzu looks at that entire framework and says, no. He warns that forced effort creates resistance, that the harder you push against the natural grain of things, the more things push back. Wu Wei is about alignment. It's about reading the current of a situation and moving with it, not against it. It's about knowing when to act and, just as importantly, when to stop acting. Lao Tzu suggests that most people ruin things not because they didn't do enough, but because they did too much. They overcorrect. They overplan. They overcontrol. And in doing so, they strangle the very thing they were trying to nurture. He puts it bluntly: When you try to hold on to something, you lose it. And this applies to everything: relationships, work, goals, even peace of mind. The moment you grip too tightly, it slips. The moment you chase too aggressively, it runs. So, what does Wu Wei actually look like in practice? It's the person who prepares deeply and then lets go of the outcome. It's the leader who guides without micromanaging. It's the artist who stops overthinking and lets the work come through them. It's not absence of effort. It's the absence of unnecessary effort. And that distinction matters. Lao Tzu isn't telling anyone to be idle. He's telling them to stop wasting energy on force that doesn't serve them, to stop mistaking struggle for progress. There's a line he uses that cuts right to the bone. The sage acts without effort and teaches without words. Not because he's passive, but because he's so aligned with the moment that effort becomes invisible. That's Wu Wei, not doing nothing, doing what's needed and nothing more. There's a line in the Tao Te Ching that stops people cold. Lao Tzu writes, "Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water, yet for dissolving the hard and inflexible, nothing can surpass it." Read that again, slowly. He's not talking about water, not really. He's talking about you, about the way you move through life, about the way you fight things that don't need fighting. Lao Tzu looked at the natural world and saw something most people miss. He saw that the things we consider weak, softness, yielding, patience, are actually the most powerful forces in existence. And the things we worship, force, aggression, relentless effort, those are brittle. They break. Think about it. A river doesn't attack a mountain. It doesn't strategize. It doesn't wake up at 4 a.m. with a plan. It just flows. Day after day, year after year, century after century. And eventually, the mountain is gone, carved into a canyon, reduced to dust. The mountain didn't lose because it wasn't strong enough. It lost because it was rigid. It couldn't adapt. It couldn't yield. And that rigidity, that refusal to bend, became its destruction. Lao Tzu argues that human beings make this exact same mistake every single day. We clench our fists, we grit our teeth, we push harder, grind longer, force our way through obstacles, like brute strength is the answer to everything. And we call that discipline. We call that ambition. We wear it like a badge of honor. But he warns that's not strength, that's tension, and tension breaks things. He points out something deeply uncomfortable. The stiff tree snaps in the storm. The flexible reed bends and survives. The hard thing shatters. The soft thing endures. And this isn't poetry for the sake of poetry. Lao Tzu is making a strategic argument about how reality actually works. Softness isn't weakness, it's intelligence. Yielding isn't surrender, it's positioning. Here's what makes this so hard for people to accept. We've been conditioned to believe that effort equals value, that struggling means you're doing it right, that if it's not painful, it's not real progress. So when someone like Lao Tzu comes along and says, "Stop pushing so hard," it feels wrong, almost offensive. But he doesn't care about what feels right to you. He cares about what's true. And the truth, as he sees it, is this: the person who forces everything exhausts themselves. The person who flows arrives. Water doesn't compete with the rock. It goes around it, under it, over it, through it. Not because it's trying to win, but because that's its nature. It follows the path of least resistance, and in doing so, it reshapes the entire landscape. Lao Tzu asks us to consider, what if that's how life is actually supposed to work? What if the constant struggle, the grinding, the white-knuckle effort. What if that's not the path to where you want to go? What if it's the very thing keeping you from getting there? He's not saying do nothing. That's where people misunderstand him. He's saying stop forcing. There's a difference, a massive one. Water moves. It's constantly in motion, but it never strains. It never fights its own current. It simply goes where the opening is. And over time, over enough time, it wears down everything in its path, not through force, through persistence, without resistance. That's what Lao Tzu saw in water, and that's what he wanted us to see in ourselves. There's something Lao Tzu understood that most people spend their entire lives missing. Happiness is not something you catch, it's something that arrives, but only when you stop running after it. He makes this point with devastating simplicity. The more you chase something, the more it escapes you. The tighter you grip, the faster it slips. And happiness, that thing everyone is desperately clawing toward, operates on the exact same principle. Lao Tzu argues that the act of pursuing happiness is itself what destroys it, not because happiness doesn't exist, but because the pursuit creates a gap, a distance between where you are and where you think you need to be. And that gap, that's suffering. That's the ache people carry around every single day without ever understanding where it comes from. He puts it plainly in the Tao Te Ching: when you are content to be simply yourself and don't compare or compete, everyone will respect you. But look at that line closely. He's not giving advice on how to earn respect. He's exposing something deeper. He's saying that the moment you stop reaching, the moment you stop measuring your life against some imagined destination, something shifts. Peace doesn't arrive because you finally got what you wanted. Peace arrives because you stopped wanting. And that sounds almost offensive to the modern mind. Stop wanting? In a world built on ambition, on goals, on more? But Lao Tzu doesn't flinch at this. He warns that desire is a trap disguised as motivation. People set a target, a salary, a relationship, a body, a lifestyle, and they believe reaching it will bring them peace. So they push, they grind, they sacrifice sleep, health, relationships, and when they finally get there, if they get there, the satisfaction lasts weeks, sometimes days. Then a new target appears, a new gap opens, and the chase begins again. He saw this cycle thousands of years ago. Nothing has changed. Lao Tzu points out that nature never rushes. A tree doesn't strain to grow. A river doesn't force its way to the sea. Things unfold. They happen, not through force, but through alignment. And he believed human life was meant to work the same way, not in laziness, not in passivity, but in a kind of deep-rooted stillness that allows the right things to come to you, rather than you burning yourself out trying to drag them closer. This is where most people misunderstand him. They hear "stop chasing" and think he's saying "stop caring." He's not. He's saying stop strangling the thing you want with your obsession over it. Stop poisoning your present moment by living entirely in a future that doesn't exist yet. He argues that happiness is not a reward waiting at the end of effort. It is a state you return to when you remove what's blocking it. And what's blocking it, almost always, is the belief that you don't have enough, that you aren't enough, that something out there will finally complete you. Lao Tzu rejects that entirely. He suggests that you were whole before the chase began. You just forgot. And so his teaching lands like a blade. You don't need to find happiness. You need to stop doing the things that push it away. The endless comparison, the restless ambition, the chronic dissatisfaction dressed up as drive. Let it go. Not because it doesn't matter, but because holding on so tightly is the very thing breaking your hands. That's what Lao Tzu understood. Happiness doesn't come to those who hunt it. It comes to those who are still enough to let it land. Lao Tzu makes a claim that sounds almost offensive in a world built on self-expression. He says, "Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know." Sit with that for a moment. He's not talking about shy people. He's not praising introverts over extroverts. He's making a much deeper point. Lao Tzu argues that real understanding, the kind that reaches bone, doesn't translate neatly into words. It can't. The moment you try to capture it in language, you've already lost something. You've already reduced it. And that's exactly how the Tao Te Ching begins, the very first line. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. He opens his entire philosophy with a warning that the thing he's about to describe can't actually be described, that words are a finger pointing at the moon, not the moon itself. So why do people talk so much? Lao Tzu has an answer for that too, and it's not flattering. He suggests that excessive speech comes from insecurity, from a need to prove, from a desperate attempt to fill a silence that most people find unbearable. He warns that the person who's always explaining, always arguing, always correcting, that person doesn't have more knowledge, they have more doubt. They're trying to convince themselves just as much as they're trying to convince you. And there's a cost to all that noise. He points out that constant talking drains something essential from a person. It scatters the mind, fragments attention, pulls energy outward when it should be flowing inward. Every word spoken is a small expenditure, and most people are spending recklessly on things that don't deserve the investment. Lao Tzu compares the wise person to water, quiet, low, uninterested in attention. Water doesn't announce itself. It doesn't argue with the rock. It just moves around it. And over time, over years, over centuries, it wears the rock down to nothing, not through force, through patience, through silence. He argues that there's a kind of power in stillness that most people will never access because they're too busy performing, too busy filling every gap with opinions and noise and commentary. They mistake volume for value. They think the loudest voice in the room is the strongest one, but Lao Tzu says it's the opposite. The loudest voice is usually the most fragile. It's shouting because it's afraid of what happens when it stops. And here's where it gets personal. He warns that this doesn't just apply to conversation. It applies to the way people live, the constant doing, the constant producing. The need to always be seen, always be heard, always be relevant. Lao Tzu saw this pattern 2,500 years ago. People exhausting themselves, not because the work demanded it, but because the silence terrified them, because stopping felt like disappearing. But he argues that the person who can sit in silence, truly sit in it, without reaching for a distraction, that person has access to something most people never will: clarity. Not the kind you get from thinking harder, the kind you get from thinking less. Lao Tzu points out that nature operates this way. The sky doesn't explain itself. The seasons don't justify their timing. A tree doesn't argue for its right to grow. Everything in the natural world moves without narration, and yet it works perfectly, without a single wasted word. He asks in his own quiet way, "Why do you think you're any different?" The answer, he suggests, is ego, and that's where the real trouble begins. Before Lao Tzu ever spoke about effort or effortlessness, he started with something more fundamental, something most people overlook because it seems too simple. Everything has two sides, not as a metaphor, as a law. Light and dark, hard and soft, action and stillness. Lao Tzu argues that the entire universe operates on this principle, this constant breathing rhythm between opposites. He calls it the interplay of yin and yang, and he doesn't treat it as decoration. He treats it as the foundation of everything. Yin, the dark, the passive, the yielding. Yang, the bright, the active, the forceful. Most people hear those words and think one is better than the other. Yang sounds strong. Yin sounds weak. So naturally, everyone wants to live in yang. Go, do, push, dominate. But Lao Tzu says that's a fatal misunderstanding. He points out that neither side exists without the other. You can't have light without shadow. You can't have motion without rest. And you can't have strength without softness. They aren't enemies, they're partners. One gives the other meaning. One gives the other power. And here's the part most people miss. They aren't static. They're always moving, always shifting. Yin turns into yang. Yang folds back into yin. It's not a line. It's a circle, a pulse, like breathing in and breathing out. You don't choose one over the other. You move with both. Lao Tzu warns that when a person tries to live entirely in yang, always active, always pushing, always on, they don't become stronger. They become brittle, rigid, and eventually they snap. He compares it to a tree in a storm. The stiff branches break, the flexible ones bend and survive. That's not weakness, that's intelligence. And this is where it gets personal, because most people are living in a state of permanent yang, constant doing, constant effort, constant noise, no stillness, no surrender, no yin at all. And they wonder why they feel hollow, why success doesn't satisfy, why they reach the top of something and feel nothing. Lao Tzu would say it's because they've cut themselves in half. They've rejected an entire dimension of their own nature, the part that listens instead of speaks, the part that receives instead of takes, the part that waits instead of charges forward. And without that half, nothing feels whole. He argues that balance isn't something you achieve once and then hold forever. It's something you practice, moment by moment. Sometimes life asks you to act. Sometimes it asks you to be still. Wisdom, in Lao Tzu's view, is knowing which one the moment requires, not defaulting to action every single time. This is hard for people to accept, especially people who've built their entire identity around effort, around being the one who never stops. But Lao Tzu isn't asking them to stop. He's asking them to notice the rhythm, to stop fighting it. To realize that rest isn't the opposite of productivity, it's the other half of it. The inhale needs the exhale, the day needs the night. And you need both sides of yourself. Lao Tzu doesn't frame this as advice, he frames it as reality. The dance of yin and yang isn't something you opt into, it's already happening in your body, in your relationships, in your work. The only question is whether you're moving with it or against it. And if you're constantly forcing, constantly grinding, constantly refusing to yield, Lao Tzu says the answer is obvious. You're fighting the very thing that's trying to carry you. Lao Tzu has this metaphor, simple on the surface, devastating once it sinks in. He calls it pu, the uncarved block. A raw piece of wood, untouched, unshaped, no chisel marks, no design imposed on it, just what it is. And Lao Tzu holds this up as the ideal state of a human being. Not after years of self-improvement, not after accumulating knowledge and credentials and labels, before all of that. He argues that people are born whole, complete, not perfect in some naive, sentimental way, but authentic, uncorrupted by the endless layering of expectations, roles, and identities that society piles on from the moment you take your first breath. And then life begins its carving. You're told who to be, what to want, how to act, what success looks like, what failure looks like. You're shaped by parents, by culture, by institutions, each one cutting away a piece of that original block. And after enough tats, you look in the mirror and don't even recognize what's staring back, because it's not you anymore. It's a sculpture someone else designed. Lao Tzu warns against this, deeply. He suggests that most of the suffering people carry isn't from what they lack, it's from what they've added. Layer after layer of conditioning, of borrowed beliefs, of ambitions that were never really theirs to begin with. And all that weight, all that carving, pulls a person further and further from their natural state. He says, the Tao is like an uncarved block of wood, simple and plain, yet no one in the world can subjugate it. And there's something fierce in that, because what he's really saying is, in your most natural, unmanipulated state, you are unconquerable. Not because you're aggressive, but because you haven't been hollowed out by pretending to be something you're not. But here's the hard part. You can't just decide to go back. You can't force simplicity. That would defeat the entire point. Lao Tzu argues that returning to the uncarved block isn't about adding a new practice or adopting a new philosophy. It's about peeling away, letting go, unlearning. And that terrifies people because most of us have built entire identities around the carvings. The job title, the reputation, the image we project. To strip all that back feels like losing yourself. But Lao Tzu would say, no, you already lost yourself. A long time ago. This is the process of finding what was always underneath. He points out that children embody this naturally. They don't perform. They don't strategize their emotions. They respond to the world directly, without filters. And he doesn't romanticize childhood. He uses it as evidence. Evidence that there was a time before the noise, before the masks, before the endless trying. Knowledge can be learned, but wisdom must be unlearned. That's the essence of what he's driving at. The more you accumulate, the further you drift from the thing that actually matters, your original nature. So the uncarved block isn't a destination. It's not some peak you climb toward. It's what's already there once you stop building on top of it. It's what remains when the pretense falls away. And Lao Tzu makes this painfully clear. The world will always try to carve you. Society needs you shaped, predictable, useful. But the person who can resist that, who can remain simple without being simplistic, open without being empty, that person holds something rare, something no amount of effort can manufacture, their own nature, untouched. Lao Tzu tells us something that cuts deep. He says, the more you try to hold on to something, the more it slips away. Not sometimes, not occasionally, always. He's describing a law of life, one most people learn too late. There's a kind of person, and you've seen them, maybe you've been them, who grips everything with white knuckles. Relationships, status, money, control. They hold on so tight their hands shake. And they believe, genuinely believe, that if they just squeeze harder, they'll keep it, they'll protect it, they'll make it permanent. Lao Tzu says no. He says that very grip is what destroys it. He uses a simple but devastating observation. He points out that when you try to grasp water in your fist, it escapes through your fingers. But when you hold your hand open, gently, the water rests. It stays. Not because you're controlling it, but because you're not. And this applies to everything, every single thing people try to hold on to with force. He argues that the person who chases approval never feels approved of. The person who hoards wealth never feels wealthy. The person who demands loyalty never feels secure, because the act of clinging, the desperation behind it, poisons the very thing they want. Here's what Lao Tzu understood that most people don't. Grasping isn't love, it's fear. It's not ambition, it's anxiety. And fear-driven action always produces the opposite of what it intends. The man who tries to control his reputation, he becomes obsessed, paranoid. He tailors every word, every action, every appearance to an audience he can never fully please. And the more he performs, the more hollow it all becomes. The more people see through it. He doesn't build respect. He builds a cage, and he locks himself inside. Lao Tzu warns that this is what happens when you make the world something to be possessed. You stop living in it. You start managing it. And management without surrender is exhaustion without end. He points out another truth people don't want to hear. Everything is temporary. Everything. Your position, your health, your relationships, your identity. All of it is moving, shifting, changing, and the person who refuses to accept that, who fights impermanence with a clenched jaw and a tight fist, doesn't stop the change. They just suffer more when it comes, and it always comes. So what does Lao Tzu suggest? Let go. Not in the way people think, not passive, not careless, not checked out. He means something far more radical than that. He means stop treating life like something you need to capture. Stop acting like every good thing is trying to escape from you. Stop believing that the moment you relax, everything falls apart. Because, and this is the part that stings, that belief itself is what makes things fall apart. Lao Tzu argues that the person who holds loosely holds longer. The person who doesn't chase gets followed. The person who stops performing becomes magnetic. Not because they've mastered some trick, but because they've stopped interfering with something that was already working. There's a strange paradox buried in his teaching. The less you try to own the moment, the more fully you experience it. The less you try to control people, the more they trust you. The less you try to force an outcome, the more likely it arrives. He saw this thousands of years ago, and most people still haven't caught up. The man who tried to hold the world, he lost it. Not because the world was taken from him, but because his grip was the thing that pushed it away. Lao Tzu asks one of the most quietly devastating questions ever put into words. Do you have the patience to wait till your mud settles and the water is clear? Most people don't, and that's exactly the problem. He uses this image, muddy water, because it reveals something people refuse to accept. You cannot force clarity. You cannot think your way into it. You cannot hustle, plan, or strategize your way to a clear mind. Clarity comes only when you stop stirring. And yet, what do people do the moment life gets confusing? The moment a decision feels heavy or a situation feels uncertain? They act. They react. They scramble. They make phone calls, ask 10 different people for opinions, overthink every angle until their head is splitting. They stir and stir and stir, wondering why they still can't see the bottom. Lao Tzu warns against this. He argues that the compulsion to do something in moments of confusion is not strength. It's panic wearing the mask of productivity, and it almost always makes things worse. He points out that muddy water clears on its own, but only if you leave it alone. Only if you resist the urge to stick your hand back in. The sediment settles, the debris drifts to the bottom. And what's left is something you could never have manufactured through effort. A stillness, a knowing, a clarity that doesn't come from figuring things out, but from letting things settle. This goes against everything people are taught. The modern instinct says, when in doubt, move faster, gather more information, analyze harder, control the outcome. But Lao Tzu says the opposite. When in doubt, wait. Be still. Do nothing. Not forever, just long enough for the water to clear. And he's not talking about laziness. Some truths only surface when the mind stops thrashing. You felt it before, a decision you agonized over for weeks, and then the answer came to you in the shower, or on a walk, or in that strange half-awake moment before sleep. It didn't come because you tried harder. It came because you finally stopped trying. That's what Lao Tzu is describing, not passivity, receptivity. He suggests that the mind, when left undisturbed, has its own intelligence, its own rhythm. It knows how to sort through chaos if you let it. But the moment you interfere, the moment you start forcing, rushing, demanding answers on your timeline, you cloud it again. You become the hand stirring the water you're desperate to see through. And here's the part that stings. Lao Tzu implies that most of the confusion people carry isn't caused by their circumstances. It's caused by their response to their circumstances. The situation may be difficult, yes, but the real mess, the fog, the paralysis, the spiraling, that's self-inflicted. That's the stirring. So what does he prescribe? Patience. Not the gritting your teeth, white-knuckle kind, the kind that trusts the process. The kind that sits with discomfort and doesn't demand an immediate resolution. The kind that says, I don't have the answer yet, and that's fine. Because the water will clear. It always does, but not on your schedule, not because you forced it, only because you finally had the discipline to be still. Lao Tzu understood something most people learn far too late. The answer is already there. You just have to stop muddying it. Most people think leadership means control, grip tighter, manage harder, watch every move, set every rule, and if things fall apart, grip even tighter. Lao Tzu says the opposite. He argues that the greatest leaders are barely noticed, not because they're absent, but because they lead in a way that feels like freedom. Chapter 17 of the Tao Te Ching lays it out plainly. When the best leader's work is done, the people say, "We did it ourselves." That's not weakness. That's the highest form of mastery. See, Lao Tzu draws a sharp line between authority and dominance. He points out that the leader who rules through fear gets obedience, but not loyalty. The leader who rules through force gets compliance, but not trust. And the moment that force is removed, everything collapses. The structure was never real. It was held together by pressure, and pressure always breaks. But the leader who governs with restraint, who steps back instead of stepping in, that leader creates something self-sustaining, something alive. He compares this to water. Again, water doesn't force its way through rock. It doesn't command the riverbed to open. It flows. It yields. And over time, it shapes everything around it without ever raising its voice. Lao Tzu argues that true leadership works the same way, not through pressure, through presence. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because most leaders, whether in politics, business, or even a household, they don't lead this way. They micromanage, they hover, they insert themselves into every decision because they believe that without them, things will fall apart. Lao Tzu warns that this is the very thing that makes things fall apart. He puts it bluntly, the more rules you create, the more criminals you produce. The more weapons a nation stockpiles, the more chaos it invites. The more you try to control people, the less controllable they become. It's a paradox, but it's one he returns to over and over again in the Tao Te Ching. Control breeds resistance, always has, always will. So what does he suggest instead? He suggests leading like the Tao itself, quietly, without spectacle, without self-promotion. The Tao gives life to everything, but it doesn't own anything. It nurtures without demanding credit. It guides without issuing commands. It holds nothing, and yet nothing falls. Lao Tzu argues that this is the model every leader should follow, not the general on horseback, not the king on a throne, but the invisible hand that sets things in motion and then lets go. That letting go part, that's where most people fail, because letting go feels like losing control, and losing control feels like failure. But Lao Tzu sees it differently. He sees letting go as the highest form of strength. The leader who can trust the process, trust the people, trust the natural unfolding of things, that leader doesn't need to control anything, because nothing is out of control. And there's a reason he warns against ambition in leadership. He argues that the leader who seeks power for its own sake will always destroy what they build. The desire to be seen, to be praised, to be remembered, it corrupts the act of leading. It turns service into performance, and performance always has an expiration date. The leader who doesn't need to be seen, who doesn't need applause, who governs so lightly that people forget there's a leader at all, that's the one who lasts, not because they fought for it, but because they didn't have to. Most people don't realize they're trapped, and that's what makes the trap so effective. Lao Tzu identifies the ego as one of the deepest prisons a human being can inhabit. Not a prison built by the world, not by circumstance, not by other people. A prison built by you, brick by brick, thought by thought, and you've been building it your entire life without ever questioning the blueprint. He argues that the ego is not who you are, it's who you think you are, and there's a devastating difference between the two. The ego is the voice that says, I need to be recognized. The voice that says, I must be right. The voice that whispers, if they don't see my worth, then something is wrong. Lao Tzu warns that this voice, the one most people mistake for their own, is the very thing keeping them from peace. And here's what makes it so dangerous. The ego doesn't feel like a cage. It feels like armor. It feels like protection. You defend your reputation. You guard your image. You fight to be seen a certain way. And every time you do, you tighten the chains. Because now you're no longer living. You're performing. Lao Tzu points out something most people miss entirely. He says the sage puts himself last and finds himself first. That's not a riddle, that's a diagnosis. He's saying the moment you stop clawing for position, the moment you release that death grip on how others perceive you, that's when you actually arrive. Not at success, not at some elevated status, but at yourself. He makes a sharp distinction in the Tao Te Ching. He says, he who knows others is wise. He who knows himself is enlightened. Most people spend their whole lives studying the world around them, reading people, analyzing situations, strategizing. But they never once turn the lens inward. They never sit with the uncomfortable question, who am I when no one's watching? Who am I when there's nothing to prove? Lao Tzu argues that the ego thrives on comparison. It feeds on it. It needs a hierarchy to survive. Am I smarter than them? more successful, more admired, and the moment you enter that game, you've already lost. Because there's no end to it. There's always someone higher, someone faster, someone with more. The ego doesn't want fulfillment. It wants fuel, and it'll burn through your entire life looking for it. So what's the key? Lao Tzu doesn't say you should destroy the ego. He doesn't say suppress it, fight it, wage war against it. That would just be more ego, dressed up in spiritual clothing. He says something far more radical. Let it go. Just release it. Stop feeding it your attention. Stop building your identity around things that shift and fade. Titles, status, approval, praise. He warns that the person who clings to reputation will be controlled by it. The person who clings to identity will be shattered when that identity is challenged. But the one who holds nothing, that person can't be shaken. Not because they're strong, but because there's nothing left to attack. That's the key Lao Tzu offers. Not a technique, not a strategy, a surrender. The willingness to stand in the world without armor, without labels, without the desperate need to be seen as something. And most people will never take it, because letting go of the ego feels like letting go of yourself. But Lao Tzu argues the opposite. He says that's the moment, the only moment, you actually find yourself. There's a river. It's been flowing for thousands of years. It doesn't strain, it doesn't hesitate, it doesn't ask permission. It just moves. Lao Tzu looked at that river and saw the deepest truth about human life. He argues that the natural state of existence is flow, not force, not struggle, not grinding your teeth and pushing harder. Flow. And here's what's uncomfortable about that. Almost everything you've been taught contradicts it. You've been told to fight for what you want, to hustle, to never quit. To push through walls, break through ceilings, outwork everyone in the room. And if things aren't working, push harder, try more, do more. Lao Tzu says that's exactly the problem. He calls it Wu Wei, and it's one of the most misunderstood ideas in the history of philosophy. Both involve movement, but one exhausts you, the other carries you. Lao Tzu points out something most people never stop to consider. The things that work best in nature never force themselves. Water doesn't force itself downhill. Trees don't strain to grow. The seasons don't struggle to change. They move because that's their nature. There's no resistance in them. But humans resist everything. They resist what they feel. They resist what's happening. They resist what they can't control. And then they wonder why they're exhausted, why nothing seems to land, why life feels like a war they didn't sign up for. He warns that this constant resistance, this obsession with forcing outcomes, is not strength. It's a symptom of being disconnected from the way things actually work. And that phrase, the way things actually work, that's what the Tao is. The Tao is the natural order, the underlying current beneath everything. Lao Tzu doesn't describe it as a god. He doesn't describe it as a rule. He describes it as a rhythm, a pulse, something you can feel if you stop clenching long enough to notice it. He argues that when you align yourself with this rhythm, things don't just get easier, they start to work. Relationships stop feeling like negotiations. Decisions stop feeling like gambles. Work stops feeling like punishment. Not because the world changed, but because you stopped fighting it. And that's the part most people miss. They think ease means weakness. They think surrender means giving up. But Lao Tzu draws a sharp line between surrender and laziness. Surrender, in his framework, is intelligence. It's the recognition that you are not separate from the current. You are part of it. And when you act from that place, your actions carry a different kind of power. Not the loud, forceful kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that doesn't need to. He points to water again and again. Water is soft, water is yielding, and yet it carves through stone, not because it tries harder, but because it doesn't stop, and it doesn't resist the shape of what's in front of it. That's Wu Wei. That's the philosophy of flow. Not doing nothing, but doing without war, moving without friction, acting without the need to dominate. Lao Tzu's argument is simple, and it cuts deep. The moment you start forcing life is the exact moment life starts breaking. The modern world worships complexity. More plans, more strategies, more tools, more noise. We've somehow convinced ourselves that the more complicated our approach, the more sophisticated we must be. But Lao Tzu looked at all of this and called it madness. He argued that simplicity is not a retreat from the world, it's a form of power, real power, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. In the Tao Te Ching, he writes, "Manifest plainness, embrace simplicity, reduce selfishness, have few desires." That's not a suggestion, that's a warning. He's saying, the moment you pile on more than you need, you start losing yourself. Not gradually, immediately. And we do it all the time. We overcomplicate our goals, we overload our schedules, we overthink our decisions until we're paralyzed, and then we wonder why nothing moves forward. Lao Tzu points out that nature doesn't operate this way. A river doesn't strategize its path to the ocean. A tree doesn't hold committee meetings about when to grow its leaves. They just move, effortlessly, according to their nature. And yet, they accomplish everything they need to. That's what simplicity looks like in action. Not laziness, not ignorance, clarity. He warns that when people chase complexity, they're usually running from something. Insecurity, doubt, fear of being seen as ordinary. So they stack layers on top of layers. Titles, possessions, elaborate plans, hoping the weight of it all will make them feel substantial. But it doesn't. It buries them. And here's the part most people miss. Lao Tzu wasn't just talking about material clutter. He was talking about mental clutter, the endless internal noise, the need to have an opinion on everything, the compulsion to plan every outcome before taking a single step. He argues that a cluttered mind is far more dangerous than a cluttered room, because a cluttered room can be cleaned in an afternoon. A cluttered mind, that takes years to undo. So what does he suggest instead? Strip it down, all of it. Your goals, your habits, your relationships, your thoughts. He doesn't say abandon them. He says refine them. Keep only what's essential. Let go of the rest. Not because it's easy, but because carrying what you don't need is what's making the journey so hard. He describes the ideal person as one who acts without effort, teaches without words, and possesses without claiming. That's radical simplicity. Not the minimalist aesthetic you see on social media, not some curated, picture-perfect emptiness. He's talking about an inner orientation, a way of moving through the world where you're not constantly adding, grasping, accumulating. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because simplicity, the way Lao Tzu describes it, requires something most people aren't willing to give: surrender. Surrender of ego, surrender of the need to impress, surrender of the belief that more is always better. He argues that the person who needs the least controls the most, not through force, not through manipulation, but through freedom. When you don't need much, very little can be used against you. Very little can shake you. You become, in his words, like water, soft, yielding, but over time, unstoppable. That's the weapon he's offering. Not a sword, not a strategy, simplicity, and it cuts deeper than any of them. The world keeps telling you to add more credentials, more connections, more ambition. Lao Tzu stands quietly on the other side and says, no, subtract, reduce, return to what's real. That is where your strength lives. Lao Tzu held three things above all else. He called them his treasures: not wealth, not knowledge, not conquest. Three qualities so simple, most people walk right past them without a second glance: compassion, frugality, and the refusal to put yourself first. That's it. That's what one of history's greatest philosophers staked everything on. And here's what makes it sting. These aren't the things people chase. Nobody's grinding for compassion. Nobody's hustling for humility. The world rewards the opposite. It rewards aggression, accumulation, the relentless need to be ahead. But Lao Tzu looked at all of that and called it a trap. He presents compassion, or Tzi, as the first treasure, and he doesn't mean it the way most people think. He's not talking about being nice. He's not talking about smiling at strangers. He's talking about a deep, almost fierce tenderness toward life itself. Lao Tzu argues that compassion is what makes a person brave. Not anger, not ambition, compassion. Because when you care deeply, genuinely, you stop performing courage, and you simply are courageous. The person who fights to protect something they love doesn't need to pump themselves up. The fire is already there. He puts it plainly: from compassion comes courage. Strip the compassion away, and all you're left with is recklessness dressed up as strength. The second treasure is frugality. And again, he's not just talking about money. He's talking about restraint, moderation, the discipline of enough. Lao Tzu warns against the kind of excess that hollows a person out, the endless wanting, the constant reaching for more. He argues that it's frugality, this willingness to hold back, to not consume everything in sight, that actually creates abundance. Because the person who doesn't drain every resource, who doesn't burn every bridge, who doesn't squeeze every drop, that person always has something left to give. They can be generous because they haven't wasted themselves. So generosity doesn't come from having more. It comes from needing less. And then there's the third treasure, the one that cuts the deepest. Lao Tzu calls it not daring to be ahead of all under heaven. A fancy way of saying, stop trying to be first. Stop shoving your way to the front. He argues that the person who refuses to compete for the top ends up leading naturally, not because they schemed for it, not because they clawed their way there, but because people trust someone who isn't desperate for power. He points out something most refuse to accept. The moment you fight to be first, you've already lost something. You've traded your steadiness for a position, your peace for a title. And titles, they don't hold you at night. Now, look at these three treasures together: compassion instead of hardness, frugality instead of excess, humility instead of ambition. Every single one runs against the grain. Every single one asks you to do less, not more, to soften, not sharpen, to pull back, not push forward. And that's the thread running through all of Lao Tzu's work. He doesn't believe the answer is trying harder. He believes trying harder, in the way most people understand it, is the very thing tearing them apart. More force, more control, more effort. And for what? To end up exhausted, empty, and no closer to anything real. His three treasures aren't a strategy. They're a surrender. A quiet, deliberate decision to stop warring with life and start moving with it. Lao Tzu doesn't ask you to be weak. He asks you to be wise enough to know that the strongest things in this world have always been soft. There's something Lao Tzu says that most people hear and immediately dismiss. He says the soft overcomes the hard, the gentle outlasts the forceful, the yielding defeats the rigid. And every bone in your body wants to reject that because we've been trained to believe the opposite, that strength means hardness, that power means force, that the one who pushes hardest, grips tightest, that's the one who wins. But Lao Tzu looks at the world, really looks at it, and he sees something entirely different. He points to water, the softest substance on earth. It doesn't fight, it doesn't resist. It moves around obstacles. It takes the shape of whatever holds it. And yet, given enough time, it carves through stone. It splits mountains. It reshapes entire landscapes. Not through aggression, through persistence, through yielding. Lao Tzu argues that this isn't just a poetic observation. It's a law, a principle woven into the fabric of existence itself. The soft will always, always defeat the hard. Not in a day, not in a week, but inevitably. And he doesn't stop at water. He warns us to look at what happens to things that are rigid. A tree that refuses to bend in the storm, it snaps. A wall that stands too stiff against the earth's shifting, it cracks. The hard and the unbending, Lao Tzu calls them the disciples of death. The soft and the yielding, he calls them the disciples of life. That's not metaphor to him. That's observation. That's truth pulled straight from nature. So what does this mean for how a person lives? It means the one who's always forcing, always pushing, clenching, white-knuckling their way through life is actually the fragile one. They look strong on the surface, but they're brittle underneath. One unexpected blow, one shift they didn't plan for, and they shatter. The one who bends, who adapts, who meets resistance not with more resistance, but with something softer, that's the one still standing when the dust settles. Lao Tzu argues that most people confuse softness with weakness, and that confusion costs them everything because they spend their whole lives hardening, building walls, tightening their grip, thinking that's how you survive, thinking that's how you win. But he points out, what you grip too tightly, you crush. What you hold too rigidly, you lose. The very act of forcing is what destroys the thing you're trying to protect. And here's what makes this so difficult to accept. It goes against every instinct we have. When things get hard, we want to push harder. When we feel threatened, we want to stiffen up, clench, fight. Lao Tzu says that's the trap. He argues that real strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It moves quietly. It adapts, it flows, like water finding the lowest point, not because it's weak, but because that's where its power gathers. There's a line in the Tao Te Ching that sits heavy once you really hear it. Lao Tzu says that nothing in the world is softer or weaker than water, and yet nothing is better at overcoming the hard and the strong. He says everyone knows this, and yet no one lives by it. That gap between knowing and doing is where most people lose their lives. They know that forcing doesn't work. They've felt it, they've lived it, but they keep doing it anyway, because softness feels like surrender. Lao Tzu says it's not surrender, it's intelligence. It's alignment with the way things actually work. The soft doesn't fight the hard, it outlasts it. There's something Lao Tzu says that stops people cold the first time they hear it. He says the reason no one can compete with the sage is because the sage refuses to compete. Sit with that for a moment. Not that the sage competes and wins, not that the sage competes harder, smarter, longer than everyone else. No, he argues that the sage simply steps out of the race entirely. And because of that specific refusal, no one can touch him. It sounds backwards. It sounds like losing. But Lao Tzu would say that's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people trapped. He points out that competition, by its very nature, puts you in a position of dependency. You're reacting. You're measuring yourself against someone else's pace, someone else's standards, someone else's definition of what winning even looks like. And the moment you do that, you've already handed your power away. You're no longer moving from your own center. You're moving from theirs. And that's the trap. Lao Tzu warns that the person who is constantly competing is constantly at war, not just with others, but with themselves. There's no rest in it, no arrival. Because even when you win, there's the next opponent, the next threat, the next person coming up behind you. So you grip tighter, push harder, burn faster. He saw this thousands of years ago, and nothing has changed. But here's where his thinking cuts even deeper. Lao Tzu argues that true strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. He compares it to water, soft, yielding, flowing around every obstacle without resistance. And yet, he says nothing in the world is better at overcoming what is hard and rigid. Nothing. Water doesn't fight the rock. It doesn't compete with the rock. It just moves, consistently, patiently, and over time, the rock is the one that breaks. That's not weakness. That's a completely different kind of power. He makes a distinction most people miss. There's a difference between being driven and being desperate. They're not looking sideways. They're not comparing. They're not anxious about falling behind. They're just moving, quietly, steadily. And Lao Tzu argues that this is what actually produces lasting results, not the frantic scrambling, not the obsessive comparison, but the calm, rooted presence of someone who has nothing to prove. He warns that the need to be seen as the best is itself a kind of sickness. It hollows people out because it replaces genuine purpose with performance. You stop doing the thing because the thing matters. You start doing it because people are watching. And the moment you make that shift, even slightly, something essential dies. The work becomes about applause. The effort becomes about ranking. And you lose the very thing that made you effective in the first place. So when Lao Tzu says, do not compete, he's not saying give up. He's not saying be passive. He's saying something far more radical. He's saying, stop letting other people's races dictate where you run. The person who refuses to compete isn't weak. They're free. And according to Lao Tzu, that freedom is the one thing no competitor can ever take from you. Not because you fought for it, but because you are wise enough to stop fighting altogether. That's not surrender. That's mastery. Everyone's chasing fullness. More knowledge, more possessions, more accomplishments. Stack it all up. Fill every corner. Leave no space empty. That's the formula, right? The fuller you are, the more valuable you become. Lao Tzu disagrees completely. He argues that emptiness is not the absence of value. It is the very thing that creates value. Chapter 11 of the Tao Te Ching makes this case with brutal simplicity. He points to a wheel. 30 spokes connect to a hub, but it's the hole in the center, the empty space, that makes the wheel turn. Without that void, the wheel is useless, just wood and metal going nowhere. He doesn't stop there. He points to a clay pot. You shape the walls, you mold the form, but it's the hollow inside that holds the water. Without that emptiness, it's just a lump of clay. Then a room. You build 4 walls, cut a door, frame a window, but you don't live in the walls. You live in the space between them. His point is devastating in its clarity. We build around emptiness. We depend on it. And yet, we spend our entire lives trying to eliminate it. Lao Tzu argues that this obsession with fullness is what keeps people stuck. A mind crammed with opinions has no room for understanding. A life packed with ambition has no room for peace. A heart stuffed with certainty has no room for wisdom. The very thing people are running toward, fullness, is what's suffocating them. And he extends this to knowledge itself. He warns that the pursuit of learning adds something every day, but the pursuit of the Tao subtracts something every day, less and less, until you arrive at non-action. And through non-action, nothing is left undone. That sounds contradictory. It's supposed to. Because Lao Tzu isn't saying knowledge is bad. He's saying accumulation for the sake of accumulation is a trap. You keep adding layers, beliefs, strategies, frameworks, and before long, you can't move. You're buried under the weight of everything you think you know. He argues that real clarity doesn't come from filling up, it comes from clearing out. Think about it. When is the last time someone changed their mind about something important? Truly changed it? It's rare, because people don't leave space for it. Their cup is already full. There's no room for anything new to enter. And so they stay the same, year after year, gripping the same ideas, defending the same positions, never growing because there's nowhere left to grow into. Lao Tzu sees emptiness as possibility, not loss, not lack, possibility. The empty cup can receive anything. The full one can receive nothing. And he makes it clear, this isn't just about the mind. It's about the whole way a person moves through life. He argues that the person who can empty themselves of ego, of fixed identity, of the desperate need to be right, that person becomes like the Tao itself, open, receptive, unbreakable, not because they're full of strength, but because there's nothing rigid in them left to break. And that's the part people miss. They think emptiness is something to fear, something to fill as fast as possible, a gap to close, a hole to patch. But Lao Tzu says that gap, that space, is where everything useful lives. The wheel turns because of the hole. The cup holds because of the void. And a life works, truly works, only when you stop trying to fill every inch of it. There's something almost absurd about watching a person stand in a river and try to push the water upstream, arms straining, jaw clenched, every muscle burning. And the river doesn't care. It never cared. It was always going to flow the way it flows. Lao Tzu says that's exactly how most people live. He argues that the obsession with control is one of the great illusions of human life. People believe, truly believe, that if they just grip hard enough, plan carefully enough, push relentlessly enough, they can bend reality to their will. And sometimes, for a moment, it looks like it works. But Lao Tzu warns that what looks like control is often just delayed chaos. You didn't master the situation, you just postponed its unraveling. He points to nature again and again as the ultimate teacher. Water doesn't force its way through rock. It doesn't strategize. It doesn't set goals for the quarter. It flows, and over time, it carves canyons, not through aggression, through persistence without resistance. Lao Tzu argues that this is the way, not forcing, not gripping, flowing. But here's where most people stumble.
They hear let go of control and they think it means do nothing, sit on the couch, drift through life with no direction. That's not what Lao Tzu is saying, not even close. He's drawing a line between action and force, between moving with life and moving against it. You can act, you can move, you can build, but the moment you start demanding that outcomes obey your timeline, your expectations, your rigid blueprint, you've crossed the line. You've stopped flowing, and now you're drowning. Lao Tzu puts it bluntly. He says the stiff and unbending is the disciple of death. The soft and yielding is the disciple of life. That's not poetry for decoration. That's a warning. The person who refuses to bend, who insists that life must go exactly as planned, that person breaks every time. Not because they're weak, because they're brittle. They made themselves brittle by refusing to adapt. And there's something deeper here. Lao Tzu argues that the need for control is rooted in fear of the unknown, fear of loss, fear that if you loosen your grip for even a second, everything will fall apart. But he asks a devastating question through his teachings. Was it ever really together? Were you ever actually in control? Or were you just telling yourself a story so you could sleep at night? He points out that the Tao, the natural order of things, doesn't ask for your approval. It doesn't wait for your permission. Seasons change, tides shift, people come and go. And the person who fights this rhythm exhausts themselves trying to hold still what was always meant to move. So what does Lao Tzu suggest instead? Trust. Not blind trust, not passive surrender to every wind that blows, but a deep, grounded trust in the unfolding of things. He argues that when you stop white-knuckling your way through life, something unexpected happens. Things begin to arrange themselves, not perfectly, not always the way you choose, but with a kind of intelligence that your anxious, controlling mind could never replicate. The river already knows where it's going. Lao Tzu says your only job, your real job, is to stop pretending you know better. Stop steering, stop gripping the banks, and let yourself be carried. Not because it's easy, but because the alternative, fighting the current until you have nothing left, was never really living at all. A storm rolls in. Two things stand in its path. An oak tree, massive, thick, deeply rooted, and a reed, thin, small, barely noticeable. The wind hits. The oak stands firm, refuses to bend, holds its ground with everything it has. The reed, it bows, low, almost flat to the earth. The storm passes. The reed stands back up. The oak is snapped in half. Lao Tzu uses this image to make a point that most people don't want to hear. Rigidity is not strength. It's a death sentence. He argues that the things which are hard, stiff, and unyielding, they belong to death. And the things which are soft, flexible, and yielding, they belong to life. That's not poetry. That's his diagnosis of how the world actually operates. And it applies to more than trees. Think about the person who refuses to change their mind, ever, about anything. They hold their position like it's a fortress. They dig in, they clench, they treat every disagreement like a threat. Lao Tzu would say, that person is already breaking. They just don't know it yet. He warns that stubbornness disguises itself as conviction, that pride disguises itself as principle, and people hold on to their positions, their plans, their identities so tightly that when life shifts, and it always shifts, they shatter. The reed doesn't shatter, not because it's stronger, because it doesn't resist the force that's moving through it. Lao Tzu points out that this is what most people get backwards. They think bending is losing. They think adapting is compromising. They think if they just hold on long enough, the storm will stop. But storms don't care about your willpower. Storms don't negotiate. And life? Life is storm after storm after storm. He argues that true resilience isn't about how much pressure you can take before you crack. It's about how willing you are to move with what's happening instead of bracing against it. The reed survives not because it's indifferent to the wind. It survives because it responds to the wind, without ego, without resistance, without the need to prove it can stand tall while everything around it collapses. There's something deeply confronting about this. Because most people build their entire identity around being the oak, around being unmovable, around being the one who never flinches. And Lao Tzu looks at that and says, "You're not brave, you're brittle." He points out that water, again, follows this same principle. It doesn't hold a shape. It takes the shape of whatever contains it. Pour it into a glass, it becomes the glass. Pour it into a river, it becomes the river. It never insists on being one thing, and because of that, it can become anything. That's the teaching. Flexibility isn't weakness, it's survival, it's intelligence. It's the willingness to let go of what you think should be happening and respond to what is happening. Lao Tzu doesn't ask you to be passive. He asks you to be honest. Honest about what you can control, honest about what you can't, honest about the difference between standing your ground and refusing to move when the ground itself is shifting beneath you. The oak trusted its own strength, and that trust destroyed it. The reed trusted something else, the moment, the situation, the current running through it. Lao Tzu's lesson here is sharp, and it doesn't soften with time. The harder you hold on to who you think you are, the easier you are to break. There's an ancient Chinese painting that most people walk right past. It's called the Vinegar Tasters. 3 men standing around a vat of vinegar. Each one has dipped his finger in, each one has tasted it, and each one has a completely different expression on his face. The 3 men are Confucius, Buddha, and Lao Tzu. Confucius tastes the vinegar, and his face turns sour. To him, the world has fallen out of order. Humanity has drifted from its original state of harmony. Life is corrupt. It needs rules, rituals, structure. Without them, everything falls apart. So the vinegar is sour because life, as it is, has gone wrong. Buddha tastes the vinegar, and his face turns bitter. To him, the world is filled with suffering, attachment, desire, illusion. Life is pain dressed in different costumes, and the only way out is to withdraw from it, transcend it, leave the cycle behind entirely. So the vinegar is bitter, because existence itself is laced with sorrow. But then Lao Tzu tastes the vinegar, and he smiles. Not because he's naive, not because he's pretending it doesn't taste like vinegar. He smiles because, to him, the vinegar is exactly what it should be. It's not broken, it's not tragic, it's just what it is. And what it is part of the Tao. That's the core of his philosophy, right there, in one expression, one reaction, one quiet smile at a vat of vinegar. Lao Tzu argues that life doesn't need to be corrected. It doesn't need to be escaped. It needs to be understood, accepted, moved with, not against. He saw the world not as a problem to solve, but as a flow to join. And the moment you stop resisting that flow, the bitterness fades, the sourness softens. What's left is something most people never let themselves feel: peace, not the kind you earn, the kind you stop blocking. And this is what separates him from the other two. Confucius looked at the world and said, "Fix it." Buddha looked at the world and said, "Leave it." Lao Tzu looked at the world and said, "Trust it." That's not passivity. That's a radical kind of faith. Faith in the natural order. Faith that things don't need to be forced into shape. Faith that the universe, messy, chaotic, unpredictable as it is, knows what it's doing. He points out that humans are the only creatures who fight reality. A bird doesn't argue with the wind. A fish doesn't resent the current. They adapt, they move, they flow. But people taste the vinegar and immediately start looking for someone to blame, or something to fix, or somewhere to escape to. Lao Tzu says, stop. Just stop. Taste the vinegar. Really taste it. Don't label it. Don't judge it. Don't build an entire philosophy around rejecting it. Just let it be what it is. And here's the part that hits hard. He's not saying life isn't painful. He's not saying loss doesn't sting or failure doesn't burn. He's saying the sting and the burn are part of it. They belong. And the moment you make peace with that, something shifts inside you. You stop bracing. You stop clenching. You stop wasting your energy fighting what was never your enemy in the first place. The vinegar doesn't change. You do. That painting is thousands of years old, but the question it asks is still alive, still waiting. You've already tasted the vinegar. You taste it every single day. The only question is, what expression is on your face? Lao Tzu has a warning that most people will never take seriously. He says, stop thinking so much. Not think less carefully, not think worse. Stop thinking so much, period. And that sounds almost irresponsible. Because we live in a world that worships the mind, analysis, strategy, planning every step before you take it. We've built entire lives around the idea that if you just think hard enough, long enough, thoroughly enough, you'll find the right answer. Lao Tzu says that's the very thing that's keeping you stuck. He argues that the mind, left unchecked, doesn't solve problems, it creates them. It takes something simple and makes it complicated. It takes something clear and clouds it. You sit down to make a decision, and an hour later, you've thought yourself into paralysis. Not because the situation was complex, but because your thinking made it so. That's the trap. Lao Tzu points out that there's a kind of knowing that exists beneath thought, before thought. It doesn't come from analysis. It doesn't come from weighing pros and cons on a list. It comes from stillness, from being quiet enough to hear what's already obvious. But we don't trust that. We trust the noise instead. He argues that the more a person overthinks, the further they move from the truth. Not closer, further. Every additional layer of thought is another layer of distortion, another filter between you and what's real. And before long, you're not even responding to the situation anymore. You're responding to your thoughts about the situation. Your fears about it, your projections, your worst-case scenarios, none of which have happened, none of which may ever happen, and yet they feel more real than what's actually in front of you. That's what overthinking does. It replaces reality with illusion, and then you act on the illusion, and then you wonder why nothing works. Lao Tzu says the sage doesn't think his way to wisdom. He arrives at it by letting go of the need to figure everything out. There's a difference, a sharp one. The overthinker believes that clarity comes from more mental effort. Lao Tzu argues that clarity comes from less, not ignorance, not carelessness, stillness. He compares the mind to muddy water. You can't force it to become clear. You can't stir it into clarity. The only thing that works is to let it settle. Stop agitating it. Stop churning. And slowly, naturally, the mud sinks and the water becomes transparent. That's his answer to overthinking. Don't fight it. Don't try to think your way out of thinking. Just stop. Be still. Let the noise settle on its own. And most people hear that and panic because stillness feels dangerous to them. If I'm not thinking, I'm not in control. If I'm not planning, something will go wrong. If I'm not analyzing, I'll miss something. Lao Tzu says you're already missing something. You're missing everything. Because your mind is so loud, you can't hear what life is actually telling you. He warns that the person who tries to know everything ends up understanding nothing. The person who tries to control every outcome ends up controlling none. The mind was never designed to carry that weight. And when you load it with more than it was built for, it doesn't perform better. It breaks down. Overthinking isn't intelligence. Lao Tzu makes that painfully clear. It's fear dressed up as productivity. It's anxiety wearing the mask of preparation. And the way out isn't to think harder. It's to finally, fully stop. There's a way most people live that Lao Tzu would have found deeply disturbing. Not evil, not cruel, just exhausting, relentlessly, unnecessarily exhausting. He observed something about human nature that cuts right to the bone. People don't just want things, they grip them. They chase them with clenched fists and locked jaws, as if the universe will only yield to those who fight it hard enough. And Lao Tzu says that's the very thing that keeps it from yielding at all. He calls this the great misunderstanding, the belief that force is the answer, that if something isn't working, you just push harder, strategize more, sleep less, grind longer. And if it still doesn't come, well, clearly you didn't want it badly enough. He rejects that entirely. Lao Tzu argues that life has a current, a natural flow, and human beings, in their endless cleverness, have convinced themselves that they're supposed to swim against it, that resistance is the same as progress, that strain is proof of seriousness. But he asks a simple question. Have you ever watched a tree grow? It doesn't strain, it doesn't hurry, it doesn't look at the tree next to it and panic. It just grows, according to its own nature, in its own time, and no one would call a tree weak. He points out that the people who force everything, who muscle their way through relationships, through careers, through every conversation, they might get results, sure, but at what cost? He warns that what is gained by force must be maintained by force, and that is a life sentence. You never get to rest. You never get to stop performing, because the moment you do, everything you built through pressure starts to collapse. That's not strength. That's a cage you built yourself. And Lao Tzu saw this pattern everywhere. He saw it in rulers who governed through intimidation, powerful for a season, then overthrown. He saw it in warriors who fought with rage instead of awareness, dominant briefly, then destroyed. The pattern never changed. What is forced does not endure. But here's what makes his teaching so uncomfortable for most people. He's not just talking about tyrants and generals. He's talking about ordinary, everyday forcing, the forcing of a conversation that should have been left alone, the forcing of a relationship that clearly isn't right, the forcing of a career path that looks good on paper but feels dead inside. He argues that people have become addicted to control, and that addiction disguises itself as ambition, as discipline, as hustle. And because the culture rewards it, celebrates it even, no one questions it. No one stops to ask,
Is this effort, or is this just fear dressed up as effort? Lao Tzu would say it's almost always fear. Fear of being left behind, fear of not being enough, fear of what happens if you stop pushing for even one moment. And so the pushing never stops, the forcing never stops, and people wonder why they feel hollow even after getting everything they thought they wanted. He warns that this is what happens when a person loses contact with their own nature. They stop asking what actually fits. They stop listening. They just keep forcing, keep gripping, keep running a race they didn't even choose. And the harder they try to make life obey, the more life resists. That's not a punishment. According to Lao Tzu, that's a signal that something fundamental has gone wrong, not with life, but with the approach. Lao Tzu never gave a step-by-step plan. He wasn't interested in instructions, and that's exactly what makes his philosophies so difficult and so honest. He doesn't say, do this, then do that, and everything falls into place. He says something far harder. He says, stop forcing things, stop interfering. Let life move the way it was already moving before you started wrestling with it. He calls this living in accordance with the Tao, the way. And the Tao, as he describes it, isn't something you can grab hold of. You can't define it, you can't pin it down with words. He even says it himself. The Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. So right from the start, he's telling you that the deepest truth in existence can't be taught. It can only be lived. But what does that actually look like? Lao Tzu argues it starts with observation, not action. Observation. He points to nature, water, trees, seasons, and says, look at how everything moves without strain. The river doesn't try to reach the ocean, it just flows. The tree doesn't try to grow, it just grows. There's no effort in the way nature operates, no resistance, and yet everything gets done. Everything arrives exactly where it needs to be. He asks a simple question. Why do humans believe they're the exception? Why do people think that their lives require force, control, manipulation, when nothing else in the natural world operates that way? And this is where Lao Tzu draws the line between living with the Tao and living against it. The person who lives against the Tao is constantly pushing, constantly planning, constantly trying to bend reality to match what they want. And sometimes it works, for a while. But Lao Tzu warns, what is forced will eventually collapse. What is inflated will eventually deflate. What is rushed will eventually unravel. The person who lives with the Tao does something different. They respond instead of react. They wait instead of rush. They bend instead of break. Lao Tzu argues that this isn't passivity, it's intelligence. It's the awareness that life has its own rhythm, and fighting that rhythm only exhausts you. He uses the metaphor of water over and over again, and for good reason. Water doesn't fight the rock. It doesn't rage against the obstacle. It moves around it, under it, over it. Given enough time, it wears the rock away entirely. Not through force, through persistence, through patience, through the quiet, steady refusal to stop being what it is. Lao Tzu suggests that a person in harmony with the Tao operates the same way. They don't demand that the world bend to them. They move with what's in front of them. They adapt. And in that adaptation, that willingness to flow rather than fight, they find a kind of power that force could never produce. He also warns against overthinking. The mind, he argues, is often the enemy of the Tao. Not because thinking is bad, but because people think themselves out of what they already know. They complicate what is simple. They doubt what is clear. They pile layer after layer of logic on top of something that only needed stillness. So, living in accordance with the Tao isn't about doing nothing. Lao Tzu is clear on that. It's about doing what is natural, what is necessary, and nothing more. No excess, no performance, no forcing the river. Just a quiet alignment with the way things already are, and the strange, almost unsettling trust that it's enough.